Hi, I'm Dr. John Foster from Mentor Public Library. You're about to watch my talk on the Great Crash of 1929. Oh, the laughs we shall have. About an hour in, there is a Biggie Smalls reference, and you don't get that with every talk about the Great Crash. Anyway, I am starting a series on incidents in history that I think are funny or interesting or just, deserve to be talked about. And if you have something that you would really like me to talk about, feel free to drop it in the comments, and I will come up with something to say about it. So, thank you all for coming. This is, my God, what a crowd. I'm John Foster. I'm a librarian here at Mentor Public Library. I have a PhD in history from the University of Washington, which is mostly in the history of Germany. And for reasons that many of you might be aware of, that puts serious financial crises very close to my heart. I'll explain for those who don't know. This is the opening event, if you will, in our month devoted to the Roaring Twenties. So we decided to do this because this is a Great Gatsby anniversary, and because the Roaring Twenties, as evidenced by the fact that we got 97 signups for this thing, is something that really sticks in people's heads, and especially the Great Crash of '29. And it's funny how these sorts of things will stick in the kind of cultural memory of people. So for instance, in Germany, one of the things that really sticks in people's heads is the period of hyperinflation that happened between 1921 and 23. 1923 was the time. I mean, the annual inflation rate for 1923 was something like 20,000%. And that's annualized. Like, there were periods in 1923 when it was in the millions of percents. I mean, it was accelerating so fast that if you went to a restaurant, you had to pay for the meal when you ordered it, because if you waited to the end, the price would go up. And that is literally, that's literally true. But, if you want to know how that sticks with people, right, the Bundesbank, the German federal bank, to this day, one of its defining principles is price stability. But it also gets remembered the wrong way, and we're going to talk a little bit about things that people remember somewhat wrongly about the Great Depression. People say, oh, it was involved in Hitler coming to power. And it was not unrelated, but Hitler coming to power was 10 years later. Hitler coming to power was 1933. And Hitler coming to power was the result of deflation, not inflation. It's funny, we get kind of jacked up about inflation, but trust me when I say, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, deflation is a lot worse than inflation. I'll explain why. A moderate rate of inflation is okay. Economists think, and there's debate about this, around 3 to 4%, 2 to 4% is decent rate of inflation. You'd like there to be some inflation, because that means the economy is functioning. You don't want deflation. Number one, because if I'm holding on to money and I want to buy some object, right? If deflation is happening, what am I going to do? Well, I'm not going to buy it, because chances are tomorrow it's going to cost less. So that spiral keeps going. The Great Crash of '29. Okay, so the sort of key fact about the month that we're in right now is the Roaring Twenties. And why were the Roaring Twenties the Roaring Twenties? Well, number one, they came right at the end of the First World War, which was a horrific event. Millions of people were killed. Probably 50 to 53,000 Americans were killed. About 750,000 people from the United Kingdom were killed. More French, more Germans. And then right at the end of that, you get the flu epidemic, often referred to as the Spanish flu. Interestingly, in Spain, it's referred to as the French flu. I read something a couple of years ago in the sort of anniversary of it that they think it may have started in Kansas, but who knows? But everyone likes to sort of say, ha-ha, you were the people who made us all sick, which killed several million more people for a number of reasons. The influenza is a very dangerous bug, and really it's, for the best that we come up with these vaccines against it. It mutates so fast that you need to try and. It's funny, I don't know how many of you know this, when they do the flu vaccines every year, they're kind of guessing what the strain is going to be, and sometimes some years they're righter than others. But in any case, it was a very virulent strain of flu, but it was also at a time when millions of people who'd never been 20 miles away from their home were packed into high volume housing, basically soldiers' housing, and that allowed the flu to spread quite quickly. So at the end of the First World War, the First World War ends in November 1918, and then you have this period that's characterized by a whole bunch of changes. The soldiers who came back noticed all kinds of crazy things, and those of you in the back kind of can't see this, but I will point out what's here. There's, people at a kind of jazz age party. There was jazz, which was a sort of a different take on music than had really been going on. But what you would notice if you were close enough to see this picture is that all the women in it have short hair. And that's a big change. And there's a whole thing, I'm trying to remember the documentary I saw this in, but there was a kind of a march that they had in New York, and some cigarette manufacturer, there was a bunch of women marching in it, some cigarette manufacturer had organized it in such a way that these women would, in the middle of the march, all light up in unison, which was a big thing. Women were not supposed to be smoking, and certainly not in public. And the sort of tagline for this whole thing was like, they're lighting up torches of freedom. And it was very jarring especially in Europe, not quite so much in the United States, just because we only got in the very later stages, although we got in time for a fair number of Americans to see some things that they could never unsee. But these European guys came back from the trenches, which is an incredibly traumatic experience, to find this world where women were working. And that was uncommon in the pre-war period. Women were smoking. Women had short hair. Women were spending money that was not given to them by their husbands to spend. And that was a big change. And you get big technological changes. You get airplanes are much more common after the First World War. They've been developed. The development of flight was heavily promoted by people in the military in the First World War, thinking to themselves, well, how can we get over and drop something explosive on the enemy? Radio was a big thing, and it's not weird, I guess is a better way of putting it, right? Because we live in this world where media is all around us. This is what I'm about to quote is from a little bit later, but Theodor Adorno, German Jewish philosopher who fled to first England and then the United States during the Second World War, was driving around in California and flipped on the radio and all of a sudden heard Hitler's voice. And that was very jarring to him, right? Because this was like Hitler reaching out and touching him. Not that Hitler knew who he was, but it was clear that Hitler did not wish him any good. But you have these sort of a growth of a kind of media culture. You have a growth of a kind of consumer culture. You have, here's a whole picture of women doing assembly work, which was a big change. You have a period in the 1920s of real economic growth, and you also get the growth of a number of bubbles, and I want to just... So I'll talk a little about this at the end, but if you want to read, there's a lot of books about the crash of '29, and a lot of them really get into the weeds technically. Ben Bernanke, just as a for instance, who was the head of the Federal Reserve, gave a talk at Milton Friedman's birthday party in sometime in the 90s, in which he said, he's a scholar of the Great Depression. That's Bernanke's scholar of the area. And he said at this party, now having read your work, Milton Friedman, we did it. We're sorry. We'll never do it again. And the we he's talking about is central bankers. We'll get into sort of how that didn't work out. But the point here is that there's a lot of technical literature. If you really want to read what I still think is the best book on the topic, John Kenneth Galbraith, 1950, wrote The Great Crash of '29. Absolutely fabulous book, really beautifully written, very well researched. But this is a sort of example of his prose, and I think this is worth quoting at length. So the land boom got going in Florida in the early 20s, and this is the sort of origin of the kind of stereotypical, let's sell you some swampland type of story. And Galbraith writes, by the spring of 1926, the supply of new buyers, so essential to the reality of increasing prices, began to fail. As 1928 and 1929 were to show, the momentum built up by a good boom is not dissipated in a moment. For a while, in 1926, the increasing eloquence of the promoters offset the diminishing supply of prospects. Even the cathedral voice of William Jennings Bryant, which had once thundered against the cross of gold, had been for a time enlisted in the sorry task of selling swampland. But this boom was not left to collapse of its own weight. In the autumn of 1926, 2 hurricanes showed, in the words of Frederick Lewis Allen, quote, what a soothing tropic wind could do when it got a running start from the West Indies. And the second of these hurricanes, by the way, in October 1926, killed about 400 people. This was before the National Weather Service, before we had forecasting and could roughly tell, hey, a hurricane is going to happen, please go inland. I mean, Florida, there's not a lot of places to go since it's mostly pretty low-lying land. But so it was a time when there was not a lot of financial regulation. There was not a lot of regulation about who wanted to sell what. One of the sort of myths about this, it's not really a myth, is that Joseph Kennedy, father of John F. Kennedy, made a fat pile in the course of the crash of '29. He had already made a lot of money. He was one of the richest men in the country already by that point. And one reason that he was rich was because he engaged in a number of practices which, while not illegal, were very shady. These what were called investor pools, where you and a bunch of friends with money would get together and you would buy a certain stock. And it was a sort of a version of a kind of a pump and dump scandal. Or not scandal, but operation. Scandal came later. So another myth about the great crash of '29 is that everybody was in the market. You know, Joe Kennedy told this story about getting a stock tip from his shoeshine boy and knowing at that moment that it was time to get out of the market, right? Because if the shoeshine boys were, I mean, that was a sign that people who really didn't know anything about the fundamentals of what was going on in the market were in it, and the danger was very high. In fact, only 10 to 15% of U.S. households owned any stock. As a matter of fact, more U.S. households own or control stock now because of the way our retirements are organized. But what was a real growth industry at the time was what were called broker's loans. And broker's loans were a way of buying what was called on the margin. Many of you probably know what this means, but for those who don't, I'm going to explain in a very basic way. And in what follows, I'm going to really try and stay out of the technical weeds. And also, you know, just let me say, there's some controversial stuff in here, and I'm going to try and make clear when I'm expressing an opinion as opposed to when I'm saying something that's established fact. Because once again, this is a very complicated event, a complicated series of events about which there is still debate. And if you think I've got something wrong, feel free to read the literature and tell me so. You will not be alone. But that's fine. I mean, I really, you know, I don't, if people read the available stuff and say, no, like this clearly shows you're wrong, I'm okay with that. So say you have $1,000 and you would like to buy $10,000 worth of stock. So you go to a broker and you organize what's called a broker's loan. And you buy $10,000 worth of stock using a loan, using your $1,000 and a loan for $9,000. To 10% collateral is the low end. I mean, sometimes you would have more, right? But the collateral for that loan would be the stock. And the idea would be that you would hold on to the stock, and because stock prices were going up, eventually you would sell it and then you would pocket the profit. But what if it did not go up, right? Well, immediately then, the collateral for your loan is worth less. And the person holding your loan will call you up or call your broker and say, the collateral is devalued. This is a margin call. So you will then have to put up the difference between the cash that you put up and the current value of the stock that you're using as collateral. Now, that's not a huge problem as long as the general trend of the market is upward. But in the course of the second half of the 1920s, there was a dramatic increase in the use of these broker loans. spoiler alert, you'll see one of the problem that arises here later. But gross domestic product in the United States, you can see this is the sort of actual line, and then this is the kind of trend line, is going up from the 20s all the way to 1928. But, to be clear, so this is 1929, and what do you notice? It's already started to go down. And this gets to an important point about the Great Crash of '29. It did not cause the Great Depression, in the same way that the shelling of Fort Sumter did not cause the Civil War. It started the Civil War, and the Great Crash of '29 did create dynamics that led to the Great Depression, although those dynamics played into other things that were also going on at the same time. So you see that this GDP peak happens before 1929, or you could if I had drawn the vertical lines, but you'll have to take my word for it. In September of 1929, the Dow Jones, okay, so there were two major stock indexes at the time, and basically what these are is a kind of an aggregation of, they picked like about, I think 25 was the number, stocks, and they averaged the price, and that's what it is. And there were two major indexes. One was the Dow Jones, or the Dow, and the other was the New York Times. And I'll try and be clear when I'm talking about one or the other. Dow Jones in September 1929, excuse me, in the first week of September hits 386, I think. It's weird to think of like the Dow in such small numbers right now. But just as an aside, at one point when the financial crisis of 2008 got going, there had been some like pundit who had written a book, I forget his name, but it was called Dow 36,000. And Paul Krugman or someone like that was like, chances are he was off, like one of those numbers was wrong, and we'd better hope that it was like a 3 rather than a 0, right? Because the Dow at that point was heading south. Anyway, September 1929, the Dow hits about, I think 386 was the number. It would not hit that number again until 1954. So here's another sort of useful thing to keep in mind. Even in September of 1929, the stock market was already in a slightly downward trajectory. And there were some people who were raising concerns about the level of the stock market. On the other hand, there were people who were not. On December 4th, 1928, sort of jumping back a little bit, Calvin Coolidge gave his last State of the Union address in which he said, "No Congress in the United States ever assembled on surveying the state of the Union has met with a more pleasing prospect than that which appears at the present time. In the domestic field there is tranquility and contentment, and the highest record of years of prosperity. In the foreign field there is peace and goodwill, from which comes mutual understanding." Galbraith goes on to say, and breaking sharply with the most ancient of our political conventions, he omitted to attribute this well-being to the excellence of the administration which he headed. He said instead, Coolidge said, "The main source of these unexampled blessings lies in the integrity and character of the American people." But at that point, the Dow was still on a sort of upward trajectory, and the New York Times index, which ran a little higher than a Dow, hit on the last day of May 1929, 449. The volume of trading was also going up. So, I mean, think about oftentimes about 3 million shares a day. That had been the sort of norm. By 1928-29, we're moving up into 4-5 million shares a day, which is a large percent increase, right? So there's a big increase in the velocity of trading of these shares. But there was a lot of sort of boosterism for the market. Bernard Baruch gave a famous interview in the American magazine in which he said that the economic condition of the world seems on the verge of a great forward movement. Or Professor Lawrence, who's a Princeton economics professor, said that the consensus of judgment of the millions whose valuations function on that admirable market, the stock exchange, is that stocks are not at present overvalued. He added, "Where is that group of men with all the all-embracing wisdom which will entitle them to veto the judgment of this intelligent multitude, right? So if stock prices are going up, it's because people are smart. And this is the key erroneous statements in the history of financial prognostication. Irving Fisher, a very famous Yale professor, said, "Stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau." It looks permanently high till you Wile E. Coyote off the edge of it, which is basically what happened. There were some negative voices. Paul Warburg, who was the president of the International Acceptance Bank, very famous European banker, warned of unrestrained speculation and said that it was possible that this might cause a general depression. But people didn't want to hear that kind of story, right? They felt like, people are thinking, I'm trying to remember whether it was H.L. Mencken who said that the reason why there's no socialism in the United States is because every American thinks of himself as a temporarily embarrassed millionaire. And people had this idea. Now, people had this idea that the stock market was this way that you could get rich without doing any work. And that's a story that people like to hear. I wish it was true. I also wish, for my son's sake, that the Easter Bunny was a thing. But it's not. So in September 1929, there were a couple of sort of unnerving things. There was a big financial collapse in England from an investor named Hattrey. His financial interests collapsed, and that was in the news a lot. But another thing that had been going on was that the Federal Reserve started to get a little unnerved about the changes in the the structure of the U.S. economy. This has the whole Irving Fisher quote. "Stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. I do not feel that there will soon be, if ever, a 50 or 60-point break from present levels, such as bears have predicted. I expect to see the stock market a good deal higher within a few months." Sadly, no. This is corporate earnings. 1925 is 100, so it shows proportion, right? This isn't an actual number. It's a 50% increase, 100% increase. This is stock prices. You notice that there is a fairly significant divergence between these two things. And this indicates the existence of a bubble. There are some people in this world who will tell you that there is no such thing as a bubble because when I think something, the value of we're all going around evaluating things. But more responsible people, I think, it is fair to say, will note that when the valuation of something goes up dramatically without something else materially changing, then we need to be careful. And the people in the Federal Reserve looked at this and were like, that's unnerving. So what they did was they raised the discount rate. They raised the rate that they would charge banks who wanted to get loans from the Federal Reserve. And that's how our system works. Banks get this money, they circulate it. Remember that every dollar in the world was spent into existence by the federal government. And by the way, I'm just going to divert briefly into something we can talk about more later if you really are feeling like you need something to get you to sleep tonight. The United States is in a fundamentally different situation than any other country on earth. Because of what the president of France at the time, Francois Mitterrand, referred to as the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar. If the president of Nigeria wants $100, he's got to come up with $100 worth of goods and services. If the US government wants $100, they got to go over to a keyboard and hit 3 keys. Now, there are some dangers associated with this. But what it does mean is that if my debts are predominantly denominated in a currency which I can just create at will, practically, then I'm in a much different situation. So this is the situation that Germany was not in 1923. Germany was extremely indebted because of reparations to France and to Great Britain. And the people running the German central bank were like, well, we'll just print marks. Now, some people will say, well, there's a direct connection between the amount of money and the level of inflation, right? So those of you, and I'm guessing that that's practically everyone in this room, will remember watching the morning news in the 1980s, and what was a feature of the financial report every single day? What is M1, the money supply? What the hell would that tell you, right? I mean, unless you're some sort of financial operator, in which case you already know, right? But they felt the need, the financial reporter from, I'd be watching the Spokane morning news in 1981, and they would tell me what the money supply was, because it was thought at that point, contrary to some evidence, that the greater the supply of money, the greater the rate of inflation. Sometimes there's a connection, but not all the time. But so anyway, what the Federal Reserve did was say, well, we're going to raise the discount rate, we're going to raise the interest rate. So we're going to try and throttle back the amount of money in the economy. What that did was affect the Main Street economy, but not the Wall Street economy. So the effect of that was to increase the cost of credit for people, for business owners, not so much for these people, because they're not relying on loans from the Federal Reserve to do financial business. So it perversely had exactly the reverse effect that they were hoping for. That is to say, it did not throttle back the expansion of leverage in the economy. But what it did do was add to what was already happening, which was a pronounced slowdown in the sort of Main Street economy in the United States. Starting in late September, the stock market starts to crawl downward and people start to get a little bit nervous. Now, once again, you can ask what the trigger was. And the answer is, we kind of don't know. I mean, there's no real way of answering the question, because it's the result of a whole bunch of people all making independent decisions. But on that day, stocks seemed to be going lower. And the volume of stock sales on Thursday, October 21st, which is 3 days before this, was just over 6 million shares. So that's a significant increase in the number of shares getting traded, right? Another thing that happens is, so people who are in the market are now, right, if you're in the market, you just turn on CNBC or Fox Business, and you can see practically in real time what the value of what the quotes are, right? Back then, they had to use the stock ticker. And the stock ticker, as things would go on, would get further and further behind. So by the end of the day, on the 21st, the stock ticker is between 1 and 2 hours behind. So there's a lot of people out there that don't know whether they're solvent or not, and won't find out for several hours, right? And that is an alarming situation to be in. By the way, ignorance is really dangerous. What's even more dangerous is thinking you know something you don't. And that comes out in this. We're going to talk a little sort of toward the end of this thing about the difference between this and 2008. But this is something, my father was a guy who was a very bright guy. And this is one of the things that he would come back to this all the time. Ignorance is terrible. Thinking you know something you don't is really dangerous. But the problem here was that for a lot of people, they just didn't know what the situation they were in was. Toward the end of the day, stocks kind of rally, right? And people think, okay, that was ugly, but things are probably going to be okay. On Tuesday, Charles Mitchell, who's a famous financier who had been on the steamer from Europe, shows up in New York. Everybody's like, okay, the bankers are going to get together. It'll be okay. Whitney, by the way, is one of the few bankers in those days who ended up high profile going to jail for what happened later, because he had been involved in some stock manipulations which were beyond the pale of even the sort of limited financial regulation they had back then. He gives this interview, "The decline has gone too far." And what does he say about the US economy? It's fundamentally sound. Every time some politician gets on the television and it's like, the fundamentals are sound, I start thinking, I am going to dig a bunker in the backyard, because if we've got to the point that that's what they're telling us. If you're interested in sort of learning kind of the general outlines of how all this stuff works, Walter Bagehot's Lombard Street, written in the 19th century, still an excellent book to read, really well written. But one point that Bagehot makes, not quite in these exact words, but it's worth remembering. The minute that a banker has to publicly defend his creditworthiness, it's gone. Like that's, so you have to, when people in these situations get out in public and start making these statements, like you have to kind of read them in the way that Sovietologists read what the Politburo was saying in the 1960s and 70s, like, because it never quite means, like if they're out there telling you like the fundamentals are sound, like it means probably that the Titanic has just hit the iceberg and you might want to head for the boats. Thursday, October 24th. 12.9 million shares get traded, and people start to get really panicked. There's a meeting of financiers, and Mitchell, this is one of the famous moments in the New York Stock Exchange, heads down to where steel is trading, U.S. Steel is trading on the stock floor, and puts in an order for 10,000 shares at 205, which is about $5 a share higher than it's trading. And everyone's like, whew, okay, right? He's like, he's stable. He's going to stabilize the market, right? And the idea is that there'll be what was called at the time concerted effort to stabilize the market. The idea being that the financiers would sort of get it together to make this happen. Outside the exchange in Broad Street, there was a roar that could be heard as a crowd gathered. The police were there. They were afraid that there was going to be some kind of riot. At 12:30. They closed the gallery, the viewing gallery, to visitors. One of the people they shifted out then was Winston Churchill. Churchill, when he had been Chancellor of the Exchequer, had tried to get the United States to use have a more sort of expansive financial policy, and the reason was because that the British, after the First World War, had decided to go back on the gold standard. This was a catastrophic idea, because prior to the war and for a long time before that, the British pound was worth $4.89. It was just one of those numbers that you could count on. After the war, the British pound was not worth $4.89. And the arbitrage between the two caused a gold flight out of England. The gold, I'm just going to say this, people can argue with me about this later if they want to. The gold standard is one of those things that people sort of cling to, like, oh, it brings stability. Sort of, although there were financial crises in 1873, 1893, 1907, when the gold standard was, the coin of the realm. And what it does is limits government's ability to respond to a downturn by limiting the amount of money they can put in the economy. And once again, this is one of those points people really argue about. This is like Keynes versus Hayek, and we can, for those of you who want to get out the brickbats later, we can talk about that. But Keynes and Hayek, Keynes and on the one side and the Cambridge economists, and then Hayek and the Austrian economists have two fundamentally different ideas about the way the world works. Hayek thinks that people are bad and that when bad things happen, they need to, be punished. And Keynes thinks that people are basically good and that when bad things happen, you need to sort of spend countercyclically. You need to deficit spend. And the argument persists to this day. We can talk about it more if you want to. So once again, there's a kind of a brief stabilization at the end of the day. And at this point, they're so behind on trades that the stockbrokers, there they are. The stockbrokers are like sleeping in hotel rooms or any place where they can stay. If you were a little closer, you could see, guys, this guy has like a quite nice set of jammies that he's brought. But anyway, or maybe it's a dressing gown, who can say? But they're being kept there all night because there's been such a volume of trades. I mean, 12 million is more than twice as many, 12,900,000 is more than twice as many trades as has ever happened on the New York Stock Exchange. Black Monday. Black Monday, possibly the most devastating day in the financial history of the United States. And I mean, even when, everybody here lived through Lehman Weekend, which was alarming as hell. There's a thing in one of the introductions to the Galbraith book that was written by James Galbraith, his son, who's also an economist, who called him up during kind of downturn that happened in the 50s, and he asked him how he was doing, and he said, well, I've been in cash for 3 weeks, so I'm all right. But I'm afraid your mother isn't doing as well because she just can't part with those AT&T stocks that she bought from Thomas Edison for $1 a piece. Even at this point, over the weekend, Eugene Stevens, the president of the Continental Illinois Bank, said, there is nothing in the business situation to justify this nervousness. Walter Teagle, another major financier in the oil business, said that there had been no fundamental change in the U.S. economy, except for the fact that several $1 billion had gone up the flue, which I think counts as a change. On Monday, October 28th, the Dow dropped 12.8% in a single day, which was a gigantic drop in those days. I think the biggest one-day drop, somebody here can probably correct me, I remember the one in 87 where it dumped like 22% in a day or something like that, because my dad called me up and was like, you may want to stock up on food. I was in college then, so what the hell did I care? But, right. Which is a funny thing to say because, of course, it was in that moment that I learned that mattered, right? Not that I was in college, but that the fact that, our family's, wealth and the endowment of the college that my dad worked at were, materially connected to the prospect that I would be, getting further education. Galbraith says Tuesday, October 29th, was the most devastating day in the history of the New York stock market and may have been the most devastating day in the history of markets. I think this is a little bit of an overstatement, but he made it in 1950. So 16.4 million shares traded. The Dow falls 11%. Mass panic, bankruptcies, and there's another brilliant quote from our man here. Let me see if I can find it. In the first week, this is Galbraith saying again, the slaughter had been of the innocents. During the second week, there is some evidence that it was the well-to-do and the wealthy who were being subjected to a leveling process comparable in magnitude and suddenness to that presided over a decade before by Lenin. So there was kind of in the middle of this, and right after this catastrophic event, the stock market goes up again for a few days. And this is what is often referred to in the business as a dead cat bounce. The origin of which is, if you drop a dead cat from high enough, it will bounce. But this did not mean that the trend was changing. The Dow rallied, gained 12% on the 30th. The rally continued for a few days. November happens. Between the 1st and the 7th, the Dow dumps 40 points. And then finally, on the 13th of November, it bottoms out at 198. So it's almost 50% off from its peak at 380 some. So here's Black Monday, here's Black Tuesday, and then you get that sort of the dead cat bounce, and then it heads further south. And the reason the dead cat bounce is important is because, okay, so there's a quote that's attributed to Keynes. He actually didn't say it, but it kind of sounds like him, and he said things sort of like it. But it goes like this: the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. And if you're the kind of person who has a fair amount of cash, right, you may think to yourself at this point, well, what's wrong with the economy? Maybe not that much. Maybe there's some bargains out there to be had. And that's what happens when there are these big sort of midweek dumps in the current economy, right? Warren Buffett looks out there and thinks to himself, there's opportunity here. And more often than not, that's not a bad idea. In this case, it was suicide. Because the combination of these big market drops and the government's failure to understand what was really going on in the economy. So all this talk about the fundamentals are sound is not true. capitalist economies tend to run in cycles. There's a big debate about exactly what the periodicity of those cycles are and whether you can break out of them. This is another long-running argument among economists. But the downward cycle had started already. So the combination of that plus the excess of speculation meant that this was a sort of false dawn, right? So people see that bottom and they think now's the time to collect up some stuff that's really strong. But the fact is, the bears are everywhere, right? So there's a broad fronted decline going on in the market. So if you try and make those opportunistic purchases, chances are that money is going to go away. Now, you may be able to afford that. I mean, I'm trying to remember who said, this is another very famous quote, in a crisis, value returns to its true owners. And a lot of people were wiped out. Here's another myth. There was not a wave of suicides. In the crisis of 2008, I was living in Boston. I was working on my doctoral thesis. My wife was teaching at Harvard. And I had this friend who was a teacher off and on. When the big sort of crisis was happening around Lehman Weekend, we went walking to where the Harvard Business School is on the other side of the Charles, just to sort of see if anyone was going to be taking a header off a high. We had some time on our hands. And an excess of morbid curiosity, I think it's fair to say. Weirdly enough, and Galbraith adverts to this point, the level of suicide, the rate of suicide in the United States had been going up for a period of time, and there were some suicides. I mean, catastrophic, people commit suicide at a slightly higher rate in catastrophic periods, but it wasn't like there were bankers flipping off the tops of buildings left and right. Here, I wish I had made this bigger. This is a guy with his car, quite a nice one too. $100 will buy this car, must have cash, lost all on the stock market. And here you can see, and this is, I just put on to sort of illustrate how business was done. These are floor operatives from the New York Stock Exchange just carrying the trades. So the trades are all on paper, and they have to be taken over to the brokerage houses and registered. And you can see they're carrying in cases these trades because the volume is so high. Okay, so how did this turn into a depression? And one of the things to remember is this was not, there were some bank failures around this time for banks that were heavily leveraged. So banks are required, were not at that time, I mean the regulation was less, but to keep a certain amount of money, and then what they want to do is lend out the bulk of the money. 90%. Right, yeah, about 90% these days. My grandfather, who made a fat pile in banking in Michigan in the 1950s and 60s, was a banker in the era of what was called 2-3-4 banking. You take deposits at 2%, you lend them out at 3%, and you're on the golf course by 4 every day. And it's a boring way of making money, right? Because it's not, the rate of profit, what they like to call the haircut is not very big, but it's there and it gets bigger every day. But in 1930, there were 1,300 bank failures. I think ultimately in the course of the Depression, there were more than twice that many. There was also a collapse in consumer confidence. And what gets going here is a deflationary spiral. And a deflationary spiral is a frightening thing for 2 reasons. One, the one I was talking about earlier, which is that if you're the kind of person who has money and you want to buy something, you think to yourself, well, I'm not going to buy it today because it'll be cheaper tomorrow. I'm going to try and figure out where the bottom of this trough is, and then I'm going to spend my money then. With the result that you don't, the rate of purchasing, generally speaking, goes down. Also, if you're selling things, right, this is why a deflationary spiral is a spiral. You want to cut prices, you have to cut prices because if you're not selling stuff. But you've already produced, say you're making widgets, and you've made your widgets with the assumption that they're going to sell for price X, and you've made your investment decisions about your resources and stuff like that at that price. And then it turns out that widgets have devalued, generally speaking. Then you're in trouble, right? So, and the thing to remember too about deflation versus inflation Inflation benefits debtors because the value of dollars is lighter, right? So if you owe $1,000, I mean, this is what happened in, this is sort of one of the weird consequences of the hyperinflation in Germany, right? So say you've like contracted this debt. Say you've taken a loan for 10,000 marks or whatever. And things go along and you've been making like 100 marks a month or something like that. All of a sudden, you get paid 40,000 marks in a month because of the hyperinflation. So you go to your bank and you're like, here's 10,000 marks, thank you very much. Nice doing business with you. And a lot of like middle-class people were wiped out in this way in Germany. And that did contribute to the rise of Hitler, although once again, the rise of Hitler happened later. And just to be clear, the rise of Hitler happened in the context of a deflation that happened in the early 1930s, not inflation. But that's another thing. If you ever want me to give a talk about the hyperinflation in 1923, boy, do I know a lot about that. I know some funny stories about the hyperinflation. But also, the United States is the leading economy in the world by this point, right? This is in the wake of the Second World War, or the First World War, excuse me. All the European economies are saddled with significant levels of debt, right? Because they financed this incredibly expensive war on the cuff. Even if even if there hadn't quite been the level of like speculation and leverage going on there that there was here, we're a big economy. And then Hoover, I feel bad for Hoover. He was really not a bad guy, but he was really a wealth of bad ideas. Comes up with the Hawley-Smoot tariffs. Tariffs sometimes can actually have the effect that people think they do. I'm not going to get deeply into tariffs because I don't want to be burned in effigy here by either side. Let's just be clear. But the way a tariff works is I say, there's going to be a tariff on Japanese steel. That means that an American company that imports Japanese steel has to pay the US government a certain amount of money. And the idea is that they will then switch it will become sort of more advantageous for them to buy American steel, right? So it's not an idea that can't possibly work. It usually takes a while to work. And it has to be done in a situation when your counterparty can't do the same thing to you, which is what happened with Hawley-Smoot. Hawley-Smoot put these big time tariff barriers down, and the Europeans were like, okay, we know how to write the word tariff too. And the consequence of Hawley-Smoot tariffs was a general reduction in the level of international trade, which was exactly what none of the major industrial economies needed in that particular point. By the end of the Hoover administration, it was said that if you'd handed him a rose, it just would have died in his hand. There was another story about Hoover goes to Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, and says, can I have a nickel? I need to call a friend. And Mellon says, well, here's two. Call both of them. Hoover gets a bad rap. The problem was that he had this idea about sort of fiscal probity, that he believed in the way that my father believed in the sanctity of the Catholic Church. And I'm not going to comment on the latter thing, but in economics, you really do need to be flexible. And experience should have showed that what he was doing was not going anywhere. But his idea was that in the long run, the economy would self-regulate. And this brings us to an actual quote from John Maynard Keynes, which is one of my absolute favorite things that anybody ever said in public life. Keynes wrote this in a book he wrote called A Tract on Monetary Reform, which he wrote in the early 1920s. This long run is a misleading guide to current affairs. In the long run, we are all dead. Economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task if in tempestuous seasons they can only tell us that when the storm is long past, the ocean is flat again. And this is a point that I think is worth taking. If your idea is that we can't really do anything, we just have to sort of sit back and let it happen, that's too easy for an economist. An economist, doesn't really have a skin in the game, can just sort of sit back and not really address the actual situation. Okay, so this gets to some of the myths that we were talking about. No mass suicides. there was not like widespread speculation. It was mostly contained within a certain group. Smoot-Hawley tariffs didn't happen until 1930. The Fed didn't really do all it could. Some people think it did, but in fact, like if the Fed had engaged in a sort of more expansionary monetary policy, there's an argument to be made that that would have helped. Some people disagree. And what you get after this, you get Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall has a bunch of provisions, but the main one is that banks that take deposits cannot use those deposits to speculate in the equities market. There's a bunch of stuff here which would take us too deeply into the weeds. But what I do want to say is the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt elected in 1932. And Franklin Roosevelt gets out and says, look, we're not just going to sit on our hands here. We're going to try things. And if those things don't work, we're going to try some other things. The first thing he does two things. What are the first two things that Franklin Roosevelt does when he gets to power? One, he re-legalizes the sale of beer. And who can blame him? I mean, I think at the end of 2.5 years of financial whatever, you deserve a beer, frankly. And this was the end of Prohibition. And there's some things that you can look at Franklin Roosevelt did and you're just like, God, that may or may not have been a good idea. The end of Prohibition, that I will die on that hill. But the other one is that he had he closed the banks for a period to let people just sort of like, okay, let's, we're not going to have bank runs. We're not going to have people, because this is a kind of a moral hazard thing where you put your money in a bank and you didn't do anything wrong, right? It wasn't like you made a dumb decision with it. Like if I take my money and start speculating on swamp lots in Florida and then I lose it, that's on me. If I take my money down to the bank and I put it there, taking 2% on the dollar as a whatever, that's not like the bank has that's not a risky move where it shouldn't be. Of all the sort of debatable things, of all the things that people still debate about in the world finance, there is a lot of debate, and I cannot resolve it, about whether the New Deal actually fixed the problem. It is true that the Second World War really fixed the problem because it tamped down consumer demand, but it created vast demand for industrial products. But what Franklin Roosevelt did, and this I think is pretty firm ground. I mean, why was he giving these fireside chats? Fireside chats is something nobody had ever done. And the reason is because he was trying to communicate to the American people, look, the government cares about what happens to you. The government is not some, the fundamentals are sound. Like, the government, I want to communicate, Franklin Roosevelt, want to communicate to you, the government cares what happens to America. We're in the business of caring about what happens to Americans. So we're going to try stuff, and I'm going to explain what I'm doing to you so you can have an understanding of what it is that we're trying to do here. And that made a big difference. And there's a reason why the Democrats then win 6 elections in a row. I mean, 4 for Franklin Roosevelt, the 4th one when he's very sick and cannot campaign. And then 5 elections in a row, not 6, because Truman wins very unexpectedly against Thomas Dewey. But the Truman campaign was basically based on the idea that, you have a car now, and if the Republicans get back into power, that's going to go away. Whether that was going to be true or not, Truman didn't have a hard time convincing people that that was the case, right? The Democrats had showed themselves to be the party of expansive financial policy. The Republicans wanted to rein it in and had been running the show in 1929, and that stuck with them for a long time. And you notice that the next Republican president is who? It's Eisenhower, who has like a whole bunch of goodwill built up from the Second World War and is a financial moderate. He's not one of these people who's just like, we've got to like drain down the money supply. Okay, so for a couple of minutes here, I just want to talk really quickly about the difference between 1929 and 2008. And many of you probably already know the difference, but I will just sort of tell you that 2 things happened in 2008 that worked together. One was So for a long time in the United States, the way to increase your wealth, if you were doing nothing else, was that the value of your home was likely to increase. And home ownership was a big thing in the United States. This is why, you have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac who are out there originating loans or buying up loans. And you have government agencies, the purpose of which is to make financing available to Americans, right? And the idea, I was driving along one time in 2007 listening to the NPR station in Seattle, and they had this guy from the National Association of Realtors, and they had Michael Hudson, who's an economist who's done a lot of work on bubbles. And Michael Hudson was sort of talking about like the real estate bubble at that point, and he sort of like lays out what was in fact going to happen in the next year. And the guy from the National Association of Realtors was like, well, gee, that's a very gloom and doom type of story. We think that there's probably going to be a correction, but it's just going to get back to the trend line. And Michael Hudson said, well, maybe, but in the history of bubbles, it's never happened that when the bubble burst, it just went back to the line where it had been before. When a bubble bursts, it goes down below that trend line. So anyway, there had been deregulation in the housing market, and you got these, you guys will all remember these like ads from Countrywide, all these mortgage originators who started, and the problem, sometimes people are like, well, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, if you look at the loans, the rate of non-performing loans they put out actually it was not significant. I mean, it was not significantly worse than other reputable banks. But you have these companies, fly-by-night companies, giving out what one term that was common in the market was ninja loans. Ninja loans. No income, no job, no assets. And they were selling houses to people who were never, ever going to be able to pay them back. And then what they were doing was taking those loans and packaging them into financial instruments and then tranching them. And the thing was that so you have Moody's and Fitch, the two, there's another, who's the other big rating? Standard Poor's. And they get paid to do these ratings, right? So if you're like giving out ratings that are low, whoever it is who you're rating for is going to go to someone else, right? So you have these things, these financial instruments, they've tranched them, they've like put them into sort of chunks, right? But you don't know what's in them, and they don't know what's in them. And they have these like quants, these math guys sitting around trying to calculate the risk. And this gets back to what I was saying earlier about ignorance and knowledge, right? If you don't know what something's worth, that's one thing. But if you think it's worth something and it's not, you have a big problem. And so two things eventuated here. One was that it was supposed to distribute the risk, right? Which it did to everybody. But also, and this is the really dangerous thing, they were, laymen particularly, but most of the big houses, Goldman Sachs had a problem with this, were, those of you, people in here are probably not familiar with Biggie Small's 10 crack commandments, but they were systematically violating number 4, to wit, rule number 4, I know you've heard it before, never get high on your own supply. And they were holding on to these things on their own balance sheets. And they were using them in what are called repo transactions, right? So a repo transaction is, say you've got $100 million. And you want to do something with it. You don't have a place to put it. And you don't just want to put it in your own accounts because then it's not making any money. And you don't want to put it in a deposit account somewhere else because the FDIC will only insure it up to $250,000, right? So you go to another bank and you loan it to them, and they give you collateral. And the collateral they give you, ideally, is UST bills, right? Because if the UST bill stops being valuable, we've all got a bigger problem than the loans. I mean, that's like the road warrior time. Like it's, civilization is going to collapse. But they did all these, they started using these what to them were AAA rated securities. And then when the housing bubble burst, it became clear that a lot of these things were either valueless or could not be evaluated. And all of a sudden, these banks that were, whose sort of lifeline was these kind of repo transactions, which are often just overnight, had an immediate insolvency problem. I mean, that's what happened to Lehman. And Lehman basically ceased to exist. There was another point at which, if you're interested in this stuff, Tim Geithner wrote a really great book called Stress Test. Tim Geithner is a really funny guy. He was the Treasury Secretary while this was happening. And Tim Geithner, they're having this like negotiation. It may have been WAMU when they were going down, but they had all the stakeholders, and somebody had like offered like a 5% haircut or something like that. They would buy all their shares for like 5 cents on the dollar. And the stakeholders reps were in there, and they were like, "This is incredible. There's no, And the guys in the Treasury Department was like, "Look, this is on a Saturday night." They're like, "On Monday morning, those shares are going to be worth $0. So you have to decide, like, whether you want some money or no money, and those are the two choices that you got." So anyway, that's a long way of saying there's a big difference between what happened in 1929 and 2008 in terms of the causes. Also, there's a big difference in terms of the response. The United States became the lender of last resort for everybody. We backed up the US financial market. We backed up the euro market. We created like a swap window in Europe, and many of the European banks had big problems. I mean, the three largest French banks had an asset footprint that was something like 4 times the size of French GDP. I mean, it was so, like, there was no way that, and it was all leveraged. So like, think about what the proportion of the leverage is. If you lose that much money, you are then insolvent. And it ends up being, Geithner talks a lot about in stress tests, like sort of like people wanting this kind of like Old Testament judgment on the bankers, which is great. I mean, it's satisfying. But what it means is that, a lot of older people whose assets are basically tied up with these banks are going to lose everything for not having done anything wrong, for having done the right things all their lives, for paying into these 401ks or, having banks invest their retirement. So what the idea from the U.S. government, from the Federal Reserve perspective, was like, we're going to provide liquidity for everybody. And it was hard, like, to get it past Congress, right? Because, if you're in Congress, and especially if you're a Republican, but Barney Frank had problems with this too. This is an insane idea, right? That and it's possibly illegal, right? It's not entirely clear that the Fed can legally do these things. But the thing was, the idea was, well, the house is burning. We've got to stop the fire so that the world's economies can start to work properly again. Because if we don't, there's nothing to say that they're not going to get back down to a certain point. And here's the last thing that I'll tell you about this, and one reason why this gets to be such a big thing in the 20s, just as a for instance. What had happened, I mean, the comment about Lenin was key, right? 1929, they're only 10 years on from the Bolshevik Revolution. And there's a definite fear that lots of people are going to decide that maybe communism should, maybe capitalism doesn't seem to be working out real great. Why don't we give communism a shot? This was the reason, by the way, that the Marshall Plan comes around after the Second World War. It wasn't, oh, geez, the poor old Europeans, we really need to make them feel better about things. It was, the Communist Party is the second largest party in Italy. The Communist Party is in the French government. We need to make capitalism work so that people aren't going to develop the idea that communism is a good idea, because communism is a bad idea, right? And the only point at which it looks like a good idea is when capitalism starts to spiral the bowl. So this is really in 29. This is really in the early days of the New Deal, and in the U.S. government at the end of the Second World War. What they're trying to avoid is this sort of idea that maybe this system doesn't work right. And okay, 2008, collapse of communism has already happened, but there is a concern that if you let the system degenerate, if you let the system get to a point where it's boggling and it's not creating growth in the right way, then people are going to start to get the idea. I mean, look at what happened when COVID happened. You have all these people who don't have to go to work. If you don't have to go to work, you start thinking about doing all kinds of things. Maybe I am going to fix the government, you know? Maybe I'll get some friends and we'll do it. So there's a reason why you want the economy to work, and it's not just, you know, basic solicitude for human beings, and it's not just, you know, because you think that's the way the world should be. It's because the better the economy works, the better our system works generally. You know, if you have a job to go to, if you have some idea that, you know, you're going to be able to save money and you're going to be okay when you get too old to work, you're going to be a lot more okay with the way things are than if you're in a situation where you're just like, you know, if I have to put new tires on the car, it's going to bankrupt me. So this is something that's worth thinking when we look at the way that governments respond to these crises. And once again, the debate that you can have is, does the response actually cause the crises to get fixed faster? And that's a big, you know, that's still in play. You know, feel free to, you know, read many books on the subject and tell me I'm wrong. But the crash of '29 put an end to this kind of roaring 20s moment. It was a very sobering moment in the United States. Lots of people lost everything. Lots of people lost everything in the Depression that followed. And it was something that really changed American life, so that anybody who lived through it, I mean, you know, my grandfather was a perfect example of this. When he died, they went through his apartment up on the top of the brownstone and found $27,000 in $100 bills hid around in various places, because he was never quite sure that the money in the bank was ever going to be there ever again. And that was a big change in American life. And it's something we have a little gotten over, but you know, sometimes, what was it that Mark Twain said? History doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. So that's the thought with which I leave you.